Thank you for tuning into this video about polling and demographics in America. Let's start with looking a little bit at the American population. The American population can be studied pretty easily using demographic data, and demographic data is statistics about our population. Now, there's a whole bunch of people that study demographics, and a lot of them are pollsters, meaning they use demographics to get a good sample of the population and make sure that that sample of the population best represents the population. And the best way to figure out, where people live and what their demographic data is through the census. Every 10 years, the American population is counted via the census, which is going on right now. They've sent out a questionnaire that you fill out online, and you submit it back, and it has information like your income and your marital status and where you live and how many people are in your household. It's trying to get statistical data about the population. And this changes and people move around all over the place. So following this demographic data can show you things about America, and it can also show you, help you out if you're a pollster trying to get a good sample of people. Now, for example, here's a little look at the census, looking at population of different counties, looking at race, looking at ethnicity in those counties. So you can compare things like Wood County, Wisconsin, to Wisconsin and to the United States. So you can see how diverse our population is, or how many Asian Americans live in Wood County as compared to the United States. It gives you a good look at how even very small areas are different or similar from either the whole US or the state itself. You can also look at then, regions. If we look at a graphic like this, we can see that regions have been growing in population across the United States. And this is a layered, uh, a layered chart. So you can see the total population has grown a lot if you look at the top line above the gray. And you can also see which regions have grown more and like when they started growing. All of that could be interesting things to look at. You can look at where the Hispanic population lives in America, and you can look at where the Black population lives in America. And you can do a graphic that looks like this, where I bounce back and forth, and you can kind of see where, there may be less diversity in America due to less concentration of Hispanics or African Americans. You can look at cities. Milwaukee's always a good city to look at if you're looking at, issues around race and ethnicity and how populations can become kind of segregated by where they live. And you see in Milwaukee, there is certainly a very large concentration of African Americans living in specific neighborhoods, and Hispanic Americans living in specific neighborhoods, and you see a lot of white population in the suburbs. And so you can look at how people have become separated from each other based on race and ethnicity. You can also look at growing and shrinking populations, which is really important every 10 years for the census because eventually Congress will reapportion. If you remember what this is, they will take away seats in the House from some states and give them to other states based on population changes. So if I looked at these graphics, I see that Detroit, they've been plummeting in population. Their population was still plummeting after 2010. I would not be surprised if Michigan lost a seat or two to the southern states where you see a huge population growth. So growing states like Arizona and growing states like Florida, growing states like Texas may gain seats, whereas Michigan might lose or Ohio might lose, looking at Ohio's two major cities there. You can also look at population changes when it comes to race and ethnicity, which I think is interesting to look at as well, and it shows you how the population is becoming more diverse over time. Now, this video is great. It talks about polling in America. It talks about how polling is done. It talks about problems with polling. I would watch it. It's certainly linked for you on the calendar. We're not going to watch it here. But it does talk about sampling. And it talks about sampling it uses soup as a good analogy. That if you just skim the top of a soup, you're not necessarily getting a good sample of the entire soup. So you kind of want to swirl the soup. You kind of want to make sure that the stuff on the bottom gets pushed up to the top, and you get a good representative sample. And you only need to take a part of that soup to know what the soup's going to taste like. You don't need to drink the entire soup to know what it's going to taste like. You just to make sure you have a good sample. Just like blood, if you want to test someone for iron deficiency, you don't need to test all their blood. That would be pushing it a little too far. You just need to take a sample of blood, and that sample of blood can tell you a whole lot of stuff. So when you get a blood draw at a doctor's office, they're able to get a lot of different data just from that blood. Just like if you take a sample of some soup, you can probably get a good representation of what's in that soup and what it'll taste like. And pollsters are trying to get a good representative sample. They don't want to test the entire population. They don't want to ask the entire population a series of questions because that's impossible. They'd never be able to get around to asking everyone questions. So you want to get a good sample of people. The only way to have a good scientific poll is to get a good sample. In fact, you want it to be a random sample. You don't want to pick people that are just your friends. Uh, Sometimes in class, I like to do an activity where we create a poll in our class, and then you try to administer that poll as best you can. The problem is you don't tend to get a random sampling because you tend to ask the people you know. So that random sampling is kind of negated in many ways. And pollsters want to get a random sample. They do random digit dialing, which means they dial random numbers until they hit somebody. And they want to make sure that that random sample best represents the population. So, most often, to have a good scientific poll, you ask them demographic information first. You ask them about their age, you ask them about how many people are in their household, you ask about their sex, you ask about their income level. You're trying to get a good representation of what the population is that you're looking for. So, if you're trying to poll who people in Wisconsin support in the upcoming 2020 presidential election. You want to get a good sample of Wisconsinites. You don't want just people that live in Milwaukee. You don't want just people that live up in Rhinelander, Wisconsin. You don't want just people that are millionaires. And you don't want people that are just dairy farmers. You want a mix. You want a random sampling that includes a good chunk of people. And if after you do all your random digit dialing, you don't have a good random sample, you might ask even more people to get a better population, to get a better sample of that population. And typically you're looking at trying to get over 1,000 people for a good sample of the population. That's the best way to make sure that your sampling error, your polling error, is low. And you're trying to get a sampling error of around plus or minus 3%, which hopefully I'll explain in the next couple slides. Now, one of the issues that we probably see with random digit dialing is that there's a lot of cell phones that are kind of left out. And polling has been criticized for not, polling people that only have cell phones. So it used to be that you just used the phone book and you random digit dialed people. But what's not in the phone book? Oh, yeah, cell phones. It's just landlines. So today you have polling companies trying to reach out to that younger population, the population that doesn't have, landlines, that just has cell phones. And they're trying to do that via, websites that can do polling, via random digit dialing that can hit cell phones. They're trying to reach out to that population. Okay, let's talk sampling error. And I think this is a great, graphic to look at. That the more people you ask, the lower the sampling error. Every poll is not going to be 100% accurate unless you ask every single person. But the more people you ask, the better that population or that sample represents the population. So if you ask, you know, 1,000 people, you're getting a sampling error of 3.4%. This means that that percentage could be 3.4 higher or 3.4 lower than um, your numbers. And I'll give you an example here right now. Let's say I ask 10 people whether or not they like cheese. So I ask 10 people whether or not they like cheese, and it comes out that 50% of people like cheese. Now, my sampling error is 35%. So that means my sample, my poll is pretty bad because theoretically, the actual amount could be 85% of people liking cheese. And also, the actual amount could also be 15% of people liking cheese. So that sample is not very good. It's a very small sample, and it's not going to give you a good number to use. The 35% sampling error, that's not good. So you want to get a small sampling error. If I were to say that, you know, if we looked at a tracking poll of presidential approval ratings, and we looked at it, and it said like 43% of people approve of President Donald Trump. There might be a sampling error of like 3.5%, and that means it could actually be as low as 39.5%, or it could be as high as 46.5%. So it's giving you kind of a range. Sampling error is giving you a range. And oftentimes Americans don't realize this, so they can be very critical when a poll is not accurate to an actual election. But in all actuality, the sampling error tends to cover for that potential inaccuracy. Now, let's talk about an unscientific poll, a straw poll. Straw polls are completely unscientific polls that news media tends to do for kind of quick reactions. Real polling takes days and takes lengthy phone calls to try and ask people questions and figure stuff out. Straw polls are quick things. I always think of, let's imagine a news network. Let's imagine CNN. They put a poll on their website that says, do you approve or disapprove of what the president has done around the coronavirus? They leave that poll up for like 2 hours during a show, and at the end of the show, they talk about the results. This is very unscientific. The data is not very useful in the big scheme of things. It's only getting people that watch CNN. It's not accounting for the fact that people could have answered the question multiple times. It does not take any demographic data, so it's not a random sample. It does not get a good mix of the population. It's there's a lot of problems with straw polls. They're very unscientific and typically used by media organizations. And people like to include these as straw polls, stuff like, oh, we could look at masks, Halloween masks, and whichever Halloween mask sells the most is clearly who supported the most for presidential election. So Obama's mask sold the most, and Trump's mask sold the most. They must be the winners. Or you could look at any poll that's posted like after a debate, asking people, oh, who do you think won the debate? That stuff is not very useful, and it can be all over the place, as you see in the data on this graphic. Depending on the website you turn to, they could be much more conservative or much more liberal, and that could result in very different responses because different people are tuning in to those different networks. Now let's look at a more scientific poll, a tracking poll. I mentioned this earlier. There's tracking polls that are asked every single day. And tracking polls are great for one thing. They're great for showing you trends. So they're great for showing you approval rating and whether or not, that's going up or down. They're great for showing you, election predictions. Here you see the Trump and Clinton election. You can see their, approval going up and down and up and down leading up to the election. So you can see whether or not they're going to vote for Clinton or Trump, and you can see how that is impacted by different events. So this is great for a political campaign because you can see how different things impact the numbers. If some big scandal happens, you can see if that makes a big dent in the tracking poll. If it doesn't, then you kind of keep pushing forward. Now, some people would criticize the polling from the 2016 election. I like to take this header from 538 that says 71% versus 28%. This is the odds of winning, and 538 likes to play with the odds of winning. Does this odds of winning basically mean that 71% of the population is voting for Hillary Clinton? No, it's just saying that Hillary Clinton has the best odds of winning according to their polling data. and Donald Trump does not. It does 28% mean that Trump can still win? You bet. That's more than one fourth. That's a good chance that Trump could actually still win the presidency. So people reading this though aren't necessarily thinking about that, aren't thinking about odds of winning. And when we look at the last few polls leading up to the 2016 election, you can see they're averaging around 48% for Clinton and 46% for Trump. And they're probably averaging around 3% margin of error, that polling error. So theoretically, Trump could win, more votes. Could, have 49% of the population voting for Trump. And what's worse about looking at national polls like this is that the presidential election does not come down to a national vote. Look at the averages here. Did Hillary Clinton have more votes than Donald Trump in 2016? Yes. But that doesn't matter. All that matters is state voting because of the Electoral College. So you can get more votes, and it won't really matter because you can still win the presidency because of the Electoral College. So what's more useful in an election year like 2016 or 2020 is looking at those swing states and looking at the polling data in those states, which tends to start picking up this summer. You'll see a lot more polling data rolling in for states like Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Ohio and Florida. Here's another type of poll. It's called an exit poll. And exit polls are the perfect way to see what demographics voters had. When I fill out a ballot, and I just filled out my ballot for the 2020 primaries, it doesn't ask me anything about my demographic information. It doesn't ask me my age, my income, or any of that stuff. So what pollsters do is on election day, they camp out outside election sites, outside polling sites, and they ask people demographic information, and then they ask them who they voted for. And this is so news organizations can say, oh, look, people between age 30 and 39 voted for Obama over Romney. This is where we get to this data of who voted for whom. Now, they're not getting 100% of the population, but they are getting a good sample of the population because they are tracking demographics. Now, these exit polls might change a little bit this year. You'll probably see some more phone exit polls where they call people and ask them if they voted and ask them who they voted for and get all that demographic data. And you also see what are called entrance polls, which are polls right before the election, right as you're walking in. So you could have entrance and exit polls. And in fact, there are plenty of people that vote or that go into the polling booth and change their mind when they have the ballot. So you could have someone that gives different data in an entrance poll from an exit poll. Now, exit polls can be theoretically a nightmare, especially if you have, polling companies wanting to call an election sooner, like CBS, who called Florida for Al Gore in 2000 at 7:50 p.m. and then they took it back. And then they called Florida for George W. Bush at 2:17 a.m. and then they took that back. Exit polls can be too close to call, and today people are probably hesitant at calling the swing states very quickly. Calling Florida early is not something that actually occurs very often because it is such a swing state in today's politics. Now, there are what are called push polls, and push polls tend to be polls built to try and get some sort of response. They are polls that are trying to maybe bash a candidate. There are polls trying to hurt someone's reputation. Like, look at the second question here. Would you be more likely or less likely to vote for John McCain for president if you knew he had fathered an illegitimate black child? That's trying to, you know, get people to say they wouldn't vote for John McCain. And when someone publishes this push poll, they're probably going to leave out the second part and they're going to say, oh, people aren't going to vote for John McCain. So here they are trying to mess with people by the question. Push polls are wording questions to try and get some sort of answer. They're trying to, put something in people's minds. And when someone listens to this second question, they're probably thinking, wow, does John McCain have an illegitimate black child? Hmm. So it's trying to persuade them almost to not vote for John McCain. And that's a bad poll. Push polls are bad in general. Now, I'm going to drop this video for you in the calendar. It's about focus groups, which is certainly another type of poll. It's a type of poll that's face to face, and it's got a group of people, so it's very different. Check that out. And I'll finish off with the role of polling. Polling does help politicians. It helps candidates for office. They can figure out what stuff you like from polling without having to do their own work. So they can figure out, oh, Tammy Baldwin can look at the state of Wisconsin's polling and see what kinds of issues they care about, and can adjust things if the tracking polls show different trends. They can also be really important in close elections when to pay attention to what the people want. Now that can only go so far because people that are incumbents, of course, have a major advantage. So that can be an issue with saying polling can be powerful. Now, polling does take away influence from interest groups. If someone is pushing for, let's say, if someone's trying to push Tammy Baldwin to support a bill that is pro death penalty, this pro death penalty interest group is trying to persuade Tammy Baldwin to support it. She could look at the polling data, and if the polling data says something different, that might dissuade her from listening to the interest groups. A politician's more likely going to want to listen to what the people that vote for them want rather than just what a national interest group is interested in. And lastly, polling can be kind of controversial when it comes to the bandwagon effect. Think about it this way. If you see that everyone in your state is supporting some sort of candidate, you might want to jump on the bandwagon and support that candidate as well, without even knowing a whole lot of details about the candidate. Or if you see that, a good chunk of your population nearby is supporting a certain issue, you might want to support that type of issue. Polling can actually persuade people to vote in a certain way or not vote. If you looked at polling data in 2016, there's plenty of people that were, Hillary Clinton supporters that didn't show up to vote because the polling data and the predictions suggested that it was going to be, a lopsided victory for her. So this can certainly impact people's votes and impact people's opinions. And lastly, an election is essentially a poll. It's a poll ran by the government to try and decide who you support. And this type of poll has no margin of error. It figures out who's going to vote and who they support. And that is who wins. Thank you for tuning into this video about polling, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.